Greetings everyone, T-Strats here. First off, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for the overwhelmingly positive response to my video, The Last of Us Part 2, The Ending Explained. And I'd like to present this video as a companion piece to it. If there's anything else you'd like to see covered in relation to either of these videos, please feel free to make suggestions in the comments below. So today we're going to be taking a discerning glance at the death of Joel in The Last of Us Part 2. This is a highly controversial topic with many common complaints revolving around it not only being out of character for Joel to have been so easily deceived by Abby, to his decision to ride off to her camp, and most importantly to it having been incredibly disrespectful to the character. I feel it's important to acknowledge that many people connected so strongly with The Last of Us and the story of Joel and Ellie on multiple levels. I believe a lot of the anger directed at the game stems from people's feelings that their experience from the first game has somehow been devalued by the events of the second. It's important to note that these criticisms and complaints are not only natural, but completely understandable. So I would appreciate it if we could all be respectful of each other's opinions in the comments. If you feel I've missed an important point or misunderstood something, I would love for you to politely share your point of view with me. Now, we can all agree that a sizable portion of the Last of Us Part 2 audience are unhappy with how Joel died, but not necessarily the fact of it. It's quite revealing that the image people hold in their minds of Joel and his character seem to outweigh the circumstantial factors of a horde of infected and some in-game lore suggesting Jackson was a trading post, Joel trading for his highly coveted bag of coffee, for example, and regularly received visitors. However, the lack of clarity in this pivotal moment suggests that something has gone undeniably wrong in the execution of this plot point. This video is focused on discussing ideas, and I'm not trying to tell you you're right or you're wrong, as all opinions are welcome here. Now, while keeping all of this in mind, I'm going to make the argument that Joel's actions and choices upon meeting Abby are actually well within character for him, and not the result of bad writing. If you're already groaning, please allow me a moment to explain exactly how I'm going to try and make my argument. I'm going to be primarily looking at the decisions and choices Joel makes in the cutscenes while not introducing any outside elements, such as cultural, literary, or mythological metaphors. The purpose for using this methodology is to establish the same baseline experience from the two games from which we can all reference. I will try and develop a snapshot of Joel's character and motivations at the start and finish of the first game to clearly illustrate how his character art and decisions become more emotional and focused towards protecting Ellie. Furthermore, the breakdown of their relationship in Part 2 will be looked at in chronological order so we can have a distinct understanding of Joel at the moment he helps Abby. Lastly, I will attempt to tie all the evidence presented together to make my key argument that Joel's decision to help Abby is not only the result of his character development over the course of the two games, but is firmly rooted in his profound love for Ellie. Over the course of The Last of Us Part 1, we witness that Joel's relationship with Ellie not only changes the manner in which he views himself, but also how this relationship informs his decision-making process as well. This view is quickly validated when Joel and Ellie arrive in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and Bill calls their journey a suicide mission and berates Tess's intelligence for coming up with the idea. Surprisingly, Joel continues to fulfill this promise to Tess, despite seeing Ellie as a hindrance whose lack of experience outside the quarantine zone will likely get both of them killed. Over the course of several seasons, we see Joel bond with Ellie as he not only gives her increasing responsibility by allowing her to use more and more firearms, but also comes to admire her spirit and determination. The interactions with Bill alongside Sam and Henry also serve as parables to Joel about the dangers of grief. In the case of Bill, his inability to change caused his partner to not only grow to hate him, but ultimately resulted in Frank's suicide, with Bill's response to isolate himself even further as he was unable to deal with the guilt and pain of the repercussions. With Sam and Henry, the overprotective nature of Henry does not allow for Sam to be given agency over his own decisions. At the exact moment when Sam is infected, Ellie is armed and able to shoot off some infected, while the unarmed and naive Sam is bitten by a runner. Henry's suicide at his failure to protect his brother and having his purpose taken away from him is a dire warning to Joel. Not only is the price of failing Ellie likely to drive him to an inescapable fate, but also subtly foreshadows the danger of not trusting Ellie to make decisions for herself. By the time they arrive at the dam in Jackson, Ellie and Joel have almost fully bonded over their adventures. The bad blood between estranged brothers Tommy and Joel appears to be water under the bridge, as Tommy has discovered a new lease on life by leaving the Fireflies behind and becoming a husband and community figure. When Joel is given the chance to accept Ellie as his daughter and reclaim his status as a father, he denies her. His cold rejection of Ellie, admitting her fears and desire for Joel to not leave her, is framed as Joel still not quite having come to terms with the loss of his daughter Sarah over 20 years ago. However, on the ride back to Jackson, Joel recognizes the happiness that Tommy has found not only in being part of a community, but in his role as a husband and family member. Perhaps in an effort to avoid endangering Tommy's newfound life, Joel finally, if wordlessly, takes responsibility for Ellie's well-being. After barely escaping the University of Eastern Colorado with a shred of life, Joel awakens in a garage, injured, and Ellie nowhere in sight. Joel fights against the odds, torturing and butchering the superior numbers of David's men in Silver Lake in order to rescue her. He arrives to discover that she's protected herself by brutally killing David, offers her emotional comfort for the first time, and calls her those symbolic words, "baby girl." Joel now officially recognizes Ellie as his surrogate daughter and reclaims his role as a father. As they approach Salt Lake, we witness a changed Joel who is now fully invested in his role as a father and has seemed to heed the dire warning from Henry and Sam as to what will happen if he loses Ellie. "If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself." He has also resolved his issues with his brother, is on the verge of fulfilling his promise to Tess, and has found a true purpose in life that he hasn't felt in decades. However, once again, he finds all this could be taken from him as Ellie seems to drown in front of him just yards away from their destination, St. Mary's Hospital. Upon waking in the Firefly Hospital, Joel finds that Ellie is still alive, but discovers the fate he has brought her to. Marlene informs Joel that Ellie's death is an unfortunate requirement for the manufacturing of a vaccine, and Joel once again immediately embarks on another slaughter as he single-handedly massacres the Fireflies and saves Ellie. He even recognizes the cycles of violence that will be thematically important in Part 2, and murders Marlene in an effort to stop the repercussions. The game finally ends with Ellie recalling Riley, Tess, and Sam's deaths as she struggles with survivor's guilt and the fact that none of their deaths truly mattered if Ellie's immunity was meaningless. Joel rubs the watch Sarah gifted him hours before her tragic death and reveals that he has struggled for a long time with surviving, but that you must always find something to fight for. He then reaffirms his lie to Ellie about what actually transpired at the hospital. It seems at this point that Joel has completed his emotional journey. He has traveled back to the community at Jackson, ready to settle down, having reclaimed his role as a father again. However, despite everything seeming like a perfect end and a reward for his emotional journey, something is rotten in the state of Wyoming. Over the course of the first game, we've seen how Joel's relationship with Ellie has become the driving force in any and all decisions he makes. Originally, he makes an emotional decision to help out of a sense of obligation to Tess. By the time Joel has accepted Ellie as a daughter, he has put himself in harm's way to save Ellie twice. In both situations, it's clear he's motivated by the primal drive to protect his daughter. This is completely understandable and presents Joel as a totally dedicated father who does everything in his power to save Ellie. On the other hand, we can see that by lying to Ellie, this is not his only motivation. Joel is clearly terrified of the consequences of losing Ellie, which he has not only felt before, but seen manifested in the fates of Bill and Henry. His lie to Ellie, echoing the same mistake that Henry made with Sam, removes the ability for Ellie to make her own decisions. It also changes the nature of Tess's sacrifice and death to one which only served for Joel to regain his father figure role instead of possibly offering a hopeful future to the human race. This is further compounded by the actions of Marlene in Part 1 and Abby and her father in Part 2. To the player, it not only seems reasonable, but in some ways noble that Joel slaughters the Fireflies as they prepare to conduct their deadly but uncertain experiment on Ellie. However, Abby and her father assert they would accept the sacrifice if the tables were turned. This may be a hypothetical situation for them, but it is a very real one for Marlene. As much as Joel has assumed the role of father to Ellie, Marlene has filled the role of Ellie's mother. She not only has looked after Ellie, but promised her mother, Anna, to protect her, a parallel of the same promise Joel made to Tess. Marlene sees the hope that Ellie can bring the world, whereas Joel only sees the pain it will bring him. At the end of the game, we see this emotional decision-making taking priority again, where Joel not only takes the savior role of Ellie from humanity, keeping it purely for himself, but also conceals the choice Ellie has to bring meaning to the deaths of all those that helped her. Joel's emotional decision and lie to Ellie will come back to haunt both of them in The Last of Us Part 2, with several cutscenes flashing back to key developments in their failing relationship. The very first scene of The Last of Us Part 2 is a flashback showing Joel confessing to Tommy of his role in the events of St. Mary's and why they ended up back at Jackson. He explains the story by cleaning a guitar he's found and plans to give it to Ellie so they have a reason to still spend time together. Ellie is adjusting well to life in Jackson and has no need of a forceful protector in this new society. When we see Ellie, she appears to be relatively happy, journaling and drawing pictures of giraffes. As Joel enters her residence, which is the garage located behind his own house, he gives her the guitar and shows he is uncomfortable expressing himself with her. Joel holds a deep and profound love for Ellie, and perhaps no scene shows that more than his wonderfully planned surprise birthday party at the Science Museum. The two talk easily, constantly joke around with one another, and Joel is able to discuss Sarah without any guilt or pain. This entire scene is an example of the life he wants with Ellie, a surrogate daughter whom he can comfortably express his love with. The segment in the space capsule further illustrates the tremendous lengths Joel will go, this time in a creative aspect, to show his love for Ellie. Joel is literally showing how comfortable he is in the new world with Ellie, a vindication of the choices he made, and their false reward for accepting Joel's lies. Joel recognizes Ellie's love of space and her dream of blasting off on a rocket ship, but fails to realize they're all about leaving the problems of her world behind. Just as with the giraffe scene in Part 1, the tender moment is fleeting and fades away soon thereafter. The final moments in the flashback find Ellie uncovering a prophetic sculpture of a noble moose being torn down by a pack of wolves, and a Firefly logo emblazoned with the word liars. The liars are Joel and Ellie. While this scene is probably best viewed as a metaphor for their relationship, in terms of the character beats for Joel, we can see him instantly try to drag Ellie away from the Firefly symbol. Joel, while less overbearing of Ellie, is still unwilling to reveal the truth to her. 2 years have passed and both of them are still clinging to Joel's lie, even if it's being suggested here that Ellie is beginning to see holes in Joel's story and feels something is unresolved. Let's summarize where we are at this point. When Ellie's life was in the balance at the end of Part 1, we saw Joel act brutally to protect his daughter, and try to cover his tracks by lying to Ellie and murdering her symbolic mother in cold blood. At the beginning of Part 2, we see Joel using a gentler but still emotionally driven actions to safeguard their bond. He first attempts to continue their connection by gifting her a guitar, and during the procurement of this item, he finally admits the truth of her immunity and his rampage at St. Mary's to his brother Tommy. Second, we see him arrange a surprise birthday present for Ellie, where he recognizes her love of dinosaurs and space, and indulges these fantasies at the Wyoming Museum of Science and History. We can see here that Joel deeply loves Ellie and places an enormous emphasis on their connection and relationship. His confession to Tommy, and lack of any form of violence, emotional or physical, shows that Joel's love for Ellie has almost completely changed him from the selfish, isolated gunrunner of the first game. However, the symbol of the Fireflies with the liars written below shows something is rotten in the state of Wyoming. Both Ellie and Joel know that there are glaring inconsistencies with his story about what transpired in Salt Lake City, and despite Joel seemingly getting everything he wanted, the tension between them must eventually give, like an old guitar string. Despite the tension in this clearly loving relationship, this is the highest point we will ever see Joel at. He has finally dealt with the death of his daughter, even mentioning her without being prompted, and his confession to Tommy can be inferred that he applies no blame to Tommy over Sarah's death, and he's begun to rekindle their brotherly love. This scene at the museum represents everything Joel has fought for in part 1, and is the culmination of the growth we have seen in his character, including the shadow of his deceit. A few years later, we find Ellie with a half-completed tattoo starting to grow apart from Joel. There's a symbolic meaning to the tattoo and the guitar, which you can learn more about in this linked video. Tommy coerces Ellie to spend more time with Joel by going on a mission together to find new strings to repair her guitar. Early in the flashback, Joel surprisingly tells Ellie that he trusts her judgment regarding the dual patrols, which implies he may have heeded the warnings from the Sam and Henry chapter of part 1. However, Ellie is shown to be keeping secrets from Joel too, mainly regarding her sexuality, but also the nature of her infection. If you were to check her journal, we not only find Ellie's worries about Joel finding out she's homosexual, but also believes she isn't infectious due to her intimacy with Kat. During the course of their misadventure, Joel not only rashly 1v1s a bloater with a machete to save Ellie, but they discover the corpses of Adam and Sydney, two idealistic and naive teenagers that left Jackson to try to help the wider world. Perhaps driven by the knowledge that she can't pass her infection on, but she's also denied the opportunity to pass her immunity on to the tragic Adam and Sydney, we finally find out why Ellie's relationship with Joel is breaking apart. Ellie has begun to question the enormous holes in Joel's lie, and is beginning to accept that nothing makes sense with his story. At this point, it's possible the only thing holding her back from realizing the truth is her relationship with Joel, and this is why it's falling apart. As Ellie confronts Joel in the coffee shop, we see him react violently towards her for the first time since the ranch house in part 1, where he denied her as his daughter. Both of these instances are emotionally violent, but the reasons why have been reversed. In The Last of Us Part 1, Joel hadn't fully overcome his grief and guilt towards himself for Sarah's death and wasn't ready to fulfill his father figure role. From the museum flashback, we can see this has all been put to bed, but Joel fears losing Ellie even more. Joel knows Ellie's optimistic views and desires to help others will likely result in her at least exploring the possibility of using her immunity to make a vaccine. This is further evidenced by the guilt Ellie feels when finding the bodies of Adam and Sydney, two people she felt she was destined to help. If only they were immune, she says. Ellie also reveals that she feels empty having had the role of a savior taken from her, and is beginning to realize it was Joel that may have denied her. It is also important to note that Ellie is unaware of the sacrifice needed to manufacture this potential cure at this point in the story. She also appears to have not considered a common view of the player base about the motives of the Fireflies and the practical concerns with distributing a cure, because none of this is important to her. Ellie needs the sacrifice of Tess and the deaths of Sam, Henry, and Riley to have meaning, just as she did at the end of the first game. Joel has denied Ellie the responsibility to make these decisions for herself. Once again, it's important to point out that this doesn't necessarily make Joel out to be a bad guy or a villain. His actions are completely understandable. The issue is Joel has not taken the warnings he saw from the first game. We saw Bill drive his partner away with his inability to change, and saw him find out the devastating truth that the only person he loved in the world had grown to hate him. Joel also hasn't seen how Henry not letting Sam grow in the world and take responsibility for himself led to him being taken down by an infected horde, and Henry having failed his mission by overprotecting him. Furthermore, we see that Joel has not only denied Ellie her sense of destiny, he has forsaken his promise to Tess and rendered the deaths of all those who perished on their journey meaningless. Those deaths have done nothing but serve Joel, and is a direct contrast to what Ellie wants. Their goals and desires are now in opposition with each other, which ultimately means that something or someone must give. This confrontation finally happens at St. Mary's Hospital in Salt Lake City. Ellie has run off in the middle of the night, and finally learn the truth of what happened there 3 years ago. Ellie issues her ultimatum to Joel, threatening him with completely losing her forever, his greatest fear. In a short scene, we see Ellie honor her promise to return to Jackson, but at the cost of being completely done with Joel. It's a devastating moment for both Joel and the player alike, but a logical conclusion to Joel's overbearing and controlling nature of Ellie. For the first time, we see Ellie deny Joel. These 3 flashbacks have shown us how Joel went from having everything he ever wanted to losing it all. We have seen Ellie has been reluctant to accept the obvious lie that Joel has been telling her for years. We have seen that while Joel has slowly been accepting that he needs to change, from his confession to Tommy and acknowledging that Ellie is capable of making her own decisions over her patrol routes, that he spurned the opportunity to come clean to Ellie on his own terms. Ellie now must live with the weight of Joel's lie, knowing that she could have brought meaning to the deaths of Riley, Tess, and Sam, but Joel's lie and bloodbath at St. Mary's has taken all of this away. Now 2 years later, we find Ellie with a completed tattoo at a dance in Jackson, where Jesse reveals that Joel is still trying to exert control and protection over her by interfering with her patrol routes. Then, Dina thrusts her into the center stage before finally, but confusingly, revealing her romantic attraction to Ellie. An enraged Seth publicly calls them out, and Ellie turns on him, ready for a confrontation. However, Joel bursts into view and pushes Seth back before Ellie chastises him. This glimpse of Jackson after Ellie's return not only shows how Ellie hasn't forgiven Joel, but also shows her place in this new world and how she understands what has been taken from her. Standing on the sidelines, we see that Ellie is just an observer in this new reality and not a participant. It is only Dina who thrusts Ellie back into the light and shows her the excitement and hope this world still has to offer. When Ellie stands up to Seth and is ready to confront him, we see that Joel still hasn't learned that he must let Ellie take control for herself and steps in once more. Combined with his interfering in her patrol routes, Ellie still hasn't been able to shake off the shadow of Joel's overprotectiveness and control. It's evident there are still unresolved issues for both Ellie and Joel that need to be addressed if they are going to both continue their character development and for any hope of a meaningful connection with one another. Unfortunately, the iconic duo are never able to fully repair their relationship, as Joel is brutally beaten to death in front of a devastated Ellie. If you would like to know more about how this event affects her emotional journey, I recommend you watch my The Ending Explained video where I cover this topic in great detail. This pivotal scene and the events which lead up to it has received a lot of criticism, and I feel it's important to take a moment to acknowledge and address these things. There is an out-of-character moment and a plot contrivance which both could be amended so easily, one must certainly wonder why Naughty Dog chose not to do so. The plot contrivance is Abby angrily charging off into a snowstorm by herself and stumbling across Joel and Tommy. The game actually spends a great deal of time establishing the two-man patrol practice of Jackson, but never addresses just how unfortunate it is for Joel or how serendipitous it is for Abby to have this chance meeting. There is also a massively out-of-character moment later on, which isn't Tommy revealing their names, and that they are brothers twice, as Joel has previously compared Tommy to a thick-headed dinosaur, and Maria having literally called her husband a dumbass. The out-of-character moment is also not Joel helping or following Abby, and I will go into great detail why a little bit later in this video. The big out-of-character moment is Abby brashly blowing off Joel's kneecap. None of her crew, including the good-natured Owen, react with any surprise or even alarm to Abby's shot. This is notable given the fact that both Tommy and Ellie are eventually allowed to go free, as innocence seems to be important to the Salt Lake crew. There is absolutely no attempt from anyone in the group to definitively establish if Joel is the same Joel from St. Mary's. They hear his name and instantly descend upon him like the pack of wolves tearing down the moose in the Natural History Museum flashback. Abby has previously been told by Tommy their names, and that they are brothers, and had to take a moment to process this information. Her crew, however, do not, and all seem to fall in line with Abby blowing apart some random guest's leg. What's particularly frustrating about these two inconsistencies is there's a very easy way to explain them which has already confusingly been established through the enigmatic Eugene, the ex-Firefly and secret drug lord of Jackson. Eugene, like most of the Jackson population, is shown to be keeping secrets and also running what is likely to be the largest drug operation in the Northern Hemisphere. He is established as an ex-Firefly that felt so strongly about their cause, he abandoned his wife and child to pursue it, a direct inversion of Joel's choices. Had Eugene discovered the truth of what happened to the Fireflies in Salt Lake City, it seems entirely reasonable that before he died he would want vengeance for what Joel did. Later in the game, but chronologically earlier in the story, it is revealed that Abby has caught wind of Tommy's location from unnamed Fireflies picked up at the gates of Seattle. It appears Naughty Dog made a decision to use this flashback as an insight into Abby and Owen's relationship instead of clearly establishing how the wolves got the necessary information to hunt down Tommy and Joel. In this scene, it is revealed that Abby has already set the events in motion by assembling her squad and being granted permission from Isaac to hunt Joel. It would have been far easier and more rewarding to the player if Eugene had been used to explain Abby being able to locate Tommy and Joel so easily, and would also make her brash decision to shoot Joel without first establishing if he was indeed the Butcher of St. Mary's much more palatable. It's simply absurd to set up Eugene as a Firefly that left his family without it having any impact on a story so heavily related to the destruction of the Fireflies. Perhaps the biggest criticism of the game stems from the moment Joel chooses to help and trust Abby, citing it as an action that is completely out of character for him. The incident in Pittsburgh where Joel recognized and anticipated a hunter ambush is frequently brought up. Superficially, it does appear to be similar, a lone and helpless individuals in need of rescuing. However, there are some key differences, the first being that Abby is under siege and in mortal peril from the mindless infected, as opposed to wandering an empty street calling for help. However, the critical difference here is that Joel recognizes that this is a trap because it is one he has sprung on people in the past. It is not Joel's insight or observational skills that reveal it's a trap, it's his experience. Furthermore, we have seen that nearly everything Joel has done has been directly influenced by Ellie. We've seen him at both high points, such as the incredibly thoughtful birthday surprise at the Wyoming Museum of Science and History, and at low points, such as the confrontation outside St. Mary's Hospital in Part 2's flashback, where Ellie states their relationship is over. Both of these were, once again, influenced by Ellie. We've established that the Joel we've seen grow over the course of the two games is an emotional thinker, whether as impulsively trading for coffee, making a rash promise to Tess, or butchering two different factions to save his baby girl. Joel the smuggler may have been a pragmatic, logical thinker only concerned with margins and his own safety, but Joel the father figure is rash, impulsive, and primarily concerned with keeping Ellie safe at all costs. All the warnings from Bill and Sam regarding the importance of letting people make their own choices or suffer the dreadful consequences haven't been heeded and have come to pass. Joel, at the moment he helps Abby, might have understandably chosen to not admit any guilt to Ellie, but he is aware of the cost and the reasons behind Ellie's anger. Ellie has previously stated to Joel she felt she was meant to die and her death would have brought not only meaning to her in her own life, but to all those who fell in her name. The first time we saw her distinctly express this view was when they discovered the dead bodies of Adam and Sydney, two innocents that Ellie feels she could have helped if given the chance. Ellie has established to Joel that she feels her death was fated to bring both hope to the world and meaning to her life. If we agree that Joel's main motivation at this point is to earn his forgiveness from Ellie, we can all agree that Joel would do anything in his power to earn it, even at the expense of reason. Joel, having seen how Ellie reacted to the bodies of Adam and Sydney, as well as her coldly stating that she should have died, has seen him begin to try and show her that she was wrong. He does this by trying to save anyone he can from the infected, as this would remove the need for a vaccine. When Joel helps Abby, he is trying to show Ellie that her death was never needed. Anyone saved from a clicker is a step forward to showing Ellie her death would have been in vain, and another step towards earning her forgiveness. From his injured pursuit of Ellie in a snowstorm against an army of cannibals, to hunting down an extremely rare audio cassette of Mission Control launching a rocket, Joel has gone to extreme lengths in his love of Ellie. Both of these examples seem far less believable when compared to his helping a lone girl, the same age as Ellie, from a ravenous horde of infected. There's also a sense of tragedy here, and not just from helping his eventual assassin. Joel has misunderstood that Ellie's pain is that she believes that only her death can bring meaning to her life. And while I believe he has started to try and show her that her death wasn't needed to help those around her, he should have concentrated on showing her that her life had meaning regardless of her immunity. The second major point of contention to a large number of fans is that Tommy and Joel both agree to try to reach Abby's base camp at the chalet. It's very true that throughout the first game, Joel was highly distrusting of strangers, and for very good reasons. The only exception to this would be Sam and Henry, and their first encounter would have ended in his death without the influences of Henry and Ellie. It could be argued that living in a relatively peaceful community for years on end, trading and forming friendships, as well as Ellie having shown him that there's still decency in people, might have mellowed Joel into accepting this offer of help. Tommy, a long-term resident of a community, would presumably be well within character to accept this offer in the face of overwhelming infected numbers. You might think the threat to his brother's life, the overwhelming hordes of infected, and no viable alternatives is or isn't enough to motivate Joel past his distrust of strangers. You might think his desire to show Ellie the world didn't need her death isn't enough, and his desire to achieve Ellie's forgiveness isn't enough. Personally, I think all these would motivate Joel to flee with his brother and Abby and deal with the consequences later. The biggest issue I have isn't with the circumstances, it's that this scene would obviously be a huge shock to most of the player base. Flashbacks that happen chronologically earlier in the timeline with Abby and Owen fill in some of the details but come much later in the game's narrative, and too late for those who feel Joel and his character have been sacrificed to advance the plot. I strongly feel had Eugene been used as the catalyst to hunt down Joel, there would have been more acceptance from the Last of Us community to these events. However, if we go through all the points we've explored, I'm hopeful we can make an argument that will reconcile any lingering doubts you still have over this scene and if it was poorly written and constructed. It has been well established that Joel is not only extraordinarily protective of Ellie, but every decision that he has made over the years that doesn't involve coffee has been about her. I personally believe Joel would do anything to stay alive and continue his attempt to reconnect with Ellie. This desire to protect and love Ellie has been at the core of Joel's remarkable journey from a stoic, cold-hearted smuggler to reclaiming the role of a devoted, loving father. Joel has often been characterized as a self-serving, selfish man for his actions at St. Mary's Hospital. The interesting truth of the situation is, it's not his butchering of the Fireflies or even his cold-blooded murder of Marlene that makes him selfish. All of these actions are completely understandable given the context of his emotional journey to rediscovering his identity as a father. The flaw in Joel that makes him selfish is that he never told Ellie the truth of the matter. He never gave her the choice to make her own decision. He took her role as a savior from her and denied her the ability to bring meaning and closure to the deaths of Riley, Tess, and Sam. And furthermore, and this is a very important point, Joel never even admitted that he was wrong. He was selfish because his fear of losing Ellie stopped him from revealing the truth to her. At his end, with his brother's life hanging in the balance, Joel isn't interested in admitting any guilt to Abby. He doesn't even care what it is that he has done that has led to this fateful moment. Why is this? Because to Joel, the only thing that he has ever cared for and done in this dystopian nightmare of a new world is to protect and care for Ellie. And there is the great irony of it all. In trying to show Ellie that her death isn't necessary in this new world, he helped someone who absolutely thinks that his death is. Thank you once again for sharing your time with me today. I would be honored to hear your thoughts on this topic and discuss any questions you may have in the comments below, as well as in any future live streams. If you enjoyed this analysis and breakdown of the character arc and emotional beats of Joel, I have another video explaining the emotional journeys of Ellie and Abby and the themes present in the end of The Last of Us Part 2. If you would like to become involved in our Last of Us and Factions community, please consider joining in on our monthly community events on Twitter, as we would be delighted to welcome you. So thank you for your time, and I wish each of you a wonderful rest of your day. Cheers.